In the stone chambers of the Louvre, amid the musty smell of rotten linen and stale air, the King of France lay on his bed, wrapped in coarse cloths that had already absorbed the sour, acrid smell of burning. His hands, which had once held the crown, were bandaged up to his shoulders, and beneath the bandages, according to the court physician, Jacques Renard, the skin was black and peeling, exposing moist, reddish flesh. The fire, which he had allowed to touch his body, left deep burns on his chest and stomach. The servants allowed to approach the bed whispered that the king had done this at night, after ordering everyone to be removed from the hall, even his confessor. They said he had poured oil from the chapel lamps into a silver bowl, lit a wick, and splashed the flames on himself, saying that this would burn the devil out of his heart. Since then, he had been unable to stand. The report of the captain of the guard, dated the 4th day of September, states, "The sovereign is in a strange state of mind, his eyes are tearful and cloudy, his speech is confused. At times he calls for the late queen, at times he cries out that he sees a black dog in the corner. The smell in the chambers is unbearable, and even incense cannot overcome it." The burns began to fester. The doctors, following the customs of the time, tried to ease the king's suffering with bloodletting and rubbing the damaged skin with ointments made from resin and crushed bitter herbs. But the moisture and heat of the stone walls only intensified the decay. Pus accumulated under the bandages, and pieces of flesh remained on the bandages. Every day of dressing became torture. Access to the royal chambers was strictly limited. The list of those allowed to enter was kept by the head of the palace guard. There was a quiet dispute among the courtiers. Some claimed that the sovereign in his delirium could have changed his will, depriving someone of land or titles, while others claimed that he intended to transfer power not to his legitimate heir, but to his younger son, whom he loved more. Only one trusted valet, old Pierre Lantier, who had served the king's father, remained at the bedside at night. In his later testimony, preserved in the archives of Saint-Cloud, he stated, "The sovereign said that a black spirit was inside him and that it was burning his insides more fiercely than fire. He asked to be doused with cold water in the morning and then laid on red-hot metal again." The doctors, hearing this, decided that the delirium was caused not only by fever, but also by tissue decay. Meanwhile, in the halls, where the sick king could not go, a political game was unfolding. Old advisors, loyal to the former alliance with the southern princes, gathered in secret from the king's favorites, offering ready-made documents in case of his imminent death. The priests argued. Some believed that the illness was punishment for the sovereign's secret sins, others that it was a temptation sent from above to test his faith. Every evening, special prayers for his health were held in the chapel, but it was whispered that masses were also being said for his repose, in case the Lord took him before dawn. His physical condition deteriorated. First, his legs began to fail, swollen and covered with purple spots. They could no longer support his body. Then the king lost control of his bowels, and his bed had to be changed several times a day. His breathing became wheezing and intermittent. His heart beat unevenly, and the skin around his lips turned blue. When the burn wounds opened, a smell rose into the air that made even the hardened guards gasp for air. One of the doctors, young and inexperienced, suggested cauterizing the festering areas with red-hot iron, but the elders rejected this, fearing that the pain would kill the sovereign prematurely. At night, according to Pierre Lantier, The king often raised himself on his elbows and cried out into the void, begging his invisible enemies to leave. Sometimes he ordered bonfires to be lit in the courtyard, supposedly to drive demons out of the palace. During this time, several court ladies and servants suddenly disappeared from the Louvre. It later emerged that they had been secretly taken away for fear of being accused of witchcraft. Fear of God's judgment became obsessive. The king demanded continuous prayer and kept a cross on his chest, which left a bloody imprint on his burned skin. By the end of the first week of September, reports began to appear in the guards' reports about attempts by the heir to enter his father's chambers without permission. The guards did not allow him in, but talk of his imminent demise was no longer a secret. According to the testimony of the monk Guillaume of Saint-Denis, who twice confessed the sovereign during those days, the king asked for forgiveness for setting himself on fire to burn out evil, but allowing decay into his body. Autumn came early to the courtyard of the Louvre. Cold morning mists drifted in from the Seine, but the king's chambers were as stuffy as a bathhouse. The stone walls, heated by the summer sun, retained the heavy smell of human bodies, pus, and burnt oil. The doctors no longer argued among themselves. They all understood that the burns suffered by the sovereign were fatal. In their treatises, written years later, they mentioned that blood poisoning was inevitable. A putrid infection had penetrated deep into the tissues, rising upward and affecting the heart and lungs. Bloodletting, performed twice a day, weakened the king to the extreme. According to ancient practice, blood was drawn from a vein on the inside of the elbow. Then a compress of crushed garlic and vinegar was applied to cleanse the body's juices. But after each session, the king fell into a pale faint, and his lips were covered with a grey coating. The skin around the burns turned black, cracked in places down to the bone, and a dark liquid oozed from the cracks. One of the physicians, a monk and healer named Arno, confessed to the chamberlain that he had never seen such rapid decomposition in a living person. During those days, the court was filled with a strange mixture of reverence and predatory anticipation. The cardinal, once a close advisor, now spent more and more time in his chambers, but his men appeared in the reception halls, quietly offering to swear allegiance to the future ruler. The senior marshals argued over the distribution of land. The heir, who had been denied access to his father's bedside just yesterday, now tried every day to obtain an audience, claiming that he must personally ascertain the sovereign's condition. His mother, the widowed queen, whispered with trusted nuns, planning how to secure full power for her son in the event of his sudden death. The king, although delirious, sometimes showed frightening clarity. He could suddenly sit up and order the execution of someone from the court, accusing them of conspiracy. Several times, attempts were made to carry out such orders, but the guards hesitated, arguing that the order came from a sick man and was not sealed with a seal. Nevertheless, 2 servants disappeared, and their bodies were later found in a canal behind the palace, without signs of beating, but with bags over their heads. Letters from foreign ambassadors sent during those days describe how it was impossible to enter the king's chambers without a mask soaked in herbs. The ambassador from Naples wrote, "The stench is so strong that even the iron candlesticks standing by the bed are covered with a film of vapor." Monks from Saint-Denis, who were allowed to read psalms, returned pale and averting their eyes. It was said that the sovereign had developed festering sores on his chest, and that his bandages had to be changed not only during the day, but also at night. Otherwise, the pus would soak through the blankets. Religious panic grew. Court ladies secretly brought crosses, relics of saints, and scraps of vestments to the chambers, hoping that at least the touch of sacred objects would stop the decay of the flesh. The doctors, having no other means, began to rub powder made from crushed silver and soot into the burns, believing that this would stop the hot rot. But the burns began to spread to the neck. Convulsions appeared, the tongue swelled, and speech became slurred. The king began to choke even on water, and they began to feed him a mixture of honey and weak wine through a cloth tube. At this time, strange things were happening in the corridors of the Louvre. Several times the heir was seen leaving his father's chambers, accompanied by his personal physician, and the doors were opened without the guard's knowledge. It was rumored that opium was being added to the king's food at night to keep him asleep and out of the way of negotiations. A report by one of the captains of the guard, preserved in the city archives, contains the following lines. Today the sovereign lay motionless, his eyes closed, his breathing slow, like that of a dead man. But in the evening, he suddenly sat up and shouted loudly that he had seen the devil come out of the fireplace and demand his soul. Gradually, the king ceased to recognize even his old servants. He often grabbed them by the hands, examining their fingers as if looking for claw marks. Prayers no longer brought him comfort. He would chase the priests away, then beg them to stay. One night, he ordered a huge fire to be lit in the fireplace and tried to stand up, saying that he had to burn his body again to finally drive out the evil. The servants barely managed to keep him in bed. Meanwhile, outside the Louvre, rumors of his condition reached the people. In taverns, it was said that the sovereign was being punished for his sins, that he had burned himself for witchcraft. Peasants came to the palace gates asking that he be brought out for all to see to make sure he was still human and not a demon. But the gates remained closed. By mid-October, the Louvre was no longer a palace, but a besieged fortress. The smell coming from the king's chambers spread through the corridors and halls, permeating the tapestries, furs, and servants' hair. Even the most loyal physicians began to ask permission to leave their posts, citing ill health and weakness in the chest. By this time, the king's burns had turned into black and green pockets of decay, from which a thick, foul-smelling liquid constantly oozed. Holes appeared on the skin of his chest and abdomen in which fly larvae wriggled, having penetrated through the poorly closed windows. Realizing the hopelessness of the situation, the doctors tried to slow down the process by rubbing the wounds with hot wine and crushed myrrh, but the decay continued. Treatises of the time said that the body of the sovereign is decomposing, although he is still breathing. The king almost stopped opening his eyes. Sometimes he still came to his senses and whispered something about the devil sitting at the foot of the bed. The priest who confessed him in those moments wrote in his diary, "The sovereign asked me to tear his heart out after his death so that Satan would not take it away." The heir, upon learning of these words, ordered that no one carry out such orders, so that the body may be buried according to custom. At this time, the palace guard received new orders. No one except 3 trusted individuals was to be allowed into the royal chambers. Even the cardinal and the widowed queen now required written permission from the heir. This caused hidden anger among the old nobility. Many realized that power had already passed into other hands, and now the struggle was not to rule the country under the sick king, but to see who would take his place alongside the new one. In the evenings, delegations from provincial lords began to arrive at the Louvre, each hoping to offer their allegiance to the future ruler. But among the crowd of courtiers and strangers, rumors began to spread that the sovereign had died several days earlier, and that his heir was hiding the fact of his death in order to complete the negotiations. These conversations were fueled by long, anxious pauses in the guards' reports and the absence of public prayers for the king's health. In fact, the king was still breathing, but his breath was shallow and infrequent. His pulse was barely detectable. His face was swollen, his eyelids stuck together with pus, and his mouth resembled a dark slit without teeth. They had been removed to make feeding easier. Warm milk was fed to him through a rag tube, but he choked on it more and more often. On the night of October 20th, the guards heard a loud cry from the chambers. When they entered, the king was lying, with his head raised, staring into space with wide-open eyes. He gasped several times, "Fire!" again, and then choked and went limp. The physician on duty at the bedside pronounced him dead a quarter of an hour later, but the heir ordered silence until dawn. They began to prepare the body for embalming immediately, but the process turned into a disaster. When the bandages were removed, the stench was so bad that 2 servants fainted. The flesh fell apart at the slightest touch, and the internal organs were already decaying. According to the embalmer's recollections, the tissues looked as if they had been eaten away from the inside by fire. A huge amount of resin, honey, and wax had to be used to delay decomposition, but even this did not help. The rot continued to spread. At dawn, the death of the sovereign was announced in the council chamber. Immediately, disputes arose over the date of the heir's coronation. The old advisors tried to postpone the ceremony to finish the funeral rites, but the young ruler insisted on taking the throne as soon as possible. The news was met with a cold reception in the streets of Paris. Some said that God had punished the tyrant, while others said that his death would bring chaos. Unrest broke out outside the capital. In several provinces, local rulers refused to recognize the new king, claiming that the will had been altered in a delirium. The church, fearing the loss of influence, hastened to declare the late sovereign a martyr who fought the devil to the end. But in private conversations, priests admitted that his death was a sign that even a monarch could not escape punishment for pride and cruelty. The funeral was set for the 3rd day after his death, but even this short wait turned out to be a disaster. Despite being covered in resin and wax, the body kept decomposing. The smell was so bad that dozens of incense burners with frankincense and juniper had to be lit in the chapel, and the windows had to be covered with heavy cloths to prevent the smell from spreading through the streets. Witnesses said that the coffin had to be kept tightly closed and fastened with iron clamps. Whispers quickly spread throughout the city that the king had been eaten by evil spirits while still alive, and that an empty coffin would be displayed at the funeral. The heir, now proclaimed king, used the ceremony to consolidate his power. He gave a speech in which he called his deceased father a martyr who had fallen in the fight against the devil, and called on the people to unite. However, behind the scenes, everything was different. The new ruler's first decrees revoked a number of tax breaks granted to old allies and redistributed key lands to his young entourage. Old advisors, who had until recently held the levers of power, were sidelined or sent to the provinces under the pretext of serving the crown in the provinces. The widow of the late sovereign found herself under secret surveillance. Her chambers in the Louvre were guarded by the new king's guards, and all her letters and messages were checked. Rumors circulated that she was trying to keep a copy of the will, which was favorable to her eldest son, but the document disappeared without a trace. Several of her close associates were arrested, and later the following lines were recorded in the interrogation reports. They intended to make public the words of the late sovereign spoken to them in his delirium. The church played a double game. Publicly, the archbishops declared that the king's death was proof of his holiness, as he had burned the evil out of himself until the end. But in secret meetings, the Holy Synod agreed to support the new ruler only in exchange for an expansion of church lands and the inviolability of monastery property. In this way, the clergy strengthened its influence, taking advantage of the moment of instability. The people in the capital were wary of the changes. In the first weeks after the funeral, there were more armed patrols than merchants on the streets. Riots broke out in the suburbs over rising bread prices, but they were quickly suppressed. However, resistance lingered in the provinces. In some areas, peasants refused to pay taxes, arguing that the new king had not been blessed by the late king during his lifetime. Several castles declared themselves independent until the legitimate recognition of authority. The chronicles of those years contain records of diplomatic chaos. Ambassadors from neighboring countries suspended negotiations on marriages and alliances, waiting for the situation to stabilize. Particularly alarming was the refusal of some influential dukes to swear allegiance to the new king, justifying this by saying that the previous ruler had died in strange circumstances and hinting at the possibility of poisoning or violent intervention. 6 months after the funeral in Paris, stories were still circulating about how, in the last days of his life, the king had cried out that he was burning from within. These stories, passed from servant to servant, from merchant to peasant, turned into legends about a curse that had fallen on the royal family. For some, he became a martyr. For others, a madman who had carried out his own sentence. But the fact remained, his death marked the beginning of a new order in which power was concentrated in the hands of a small group of young favorites. The church strengthened its influence, and the provinces lost some of their independence. The Louvre, which until recently had been filled with the smell of smoke and decay, was cleaned, rebuilt, and turned into a symbol of the new regime. However, in the secret rooms, rarely visited by outsiders, there were still old, charred and blood-stained fabrics, a silent reminder that the King of France had once burned his own flesh in an attempt to burn the devil out of his heart.